So you've ran some combat encounters for your D&D group and you're realizing they're starting to look bored. So you throw even crazier monsters at them, and even though now that combat is a little more challenging, you see that they're still a little checked out. That's because a harder combat encounter doesn't necessarily mean it's an engaging one. So in this video, I'm going to show you the 3 best ways to easily punch up the engagement of your combat encounters. Stick around. Hi, my name is Tony Rodriguez, and today I'll be your EncounterSmith. Here, we like to come up with new encounters for your favorite tabletop games to make them more interesting, fun, and accessible. So the first method we're going to talk about to really punch up your combat encounters is the final form method. Now I want to talk about this one first because 1, it's probably the easiest to do, and 2, you probably shouldn't do this all the time. More on that later. Now, what is this? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you've watched any anime or video game, it's the whole trope of when you defeat the bad guy, they suddenly come up and evolve into a more powerful form. Now the reason this is the easiest one to do because all you have to do to prep for it is find 2 stat blocks with one having a slightly higher CR level. Let's give you an example. Let's say you are fighting a spellcaster who has summoned a bunch of imps. Every time one of these imps die, their soul goes from their corpse to an amulet on the spellcaster's neck. Once all of those imps die, the amulet transforms that spellcaster into a big scary demon. Now, what are the benefits of using this method? First, ideally your players won't know there's another form coming, so they'll be more inclined to use their more powerful spells and class abilities to defeat that first opponent, and then when they come back as a more powerful version of themselves, they will now have to deal with trying to figure out how to beat a more powerful version with fewer resources. Also, this is a really good method to prepare for any boss fight. There's nothing more disappointing than trying to plan a boss fight and having your paladin and rogue crit on the first round and not even giving your boss a second turn. This way, if they go down before the second round, you can bring out their final form, turning a not so great boss fight into something at least a little bit more satisfying. Some things to avoid while you're doing this. First of all, don't do it all the time. The first time you do it, it's really exciting and fun and surprising, but literally after the second time you do it, your players will be expecting this all the time, and they'll hold back all of their spells and powerful abilities in anticipation for a final form. And second, make sure you're making each form powerful. You want the first form to be strong enough to drain some of your players' resources. And also, if they felt like they did have to tangle with them when they come back at a more powerful version of themselves, it'll be that more scarier knowing that it's more powerful than the thing they just struggled with. The next method we're going to talk about are better lair actions. Now you've probably seen these with really high CR legendary creatures in all the monster manuals. But what is this? Basically, it's something dangerous that can affect your players that's not coming from a creature itself, it's mostly coming from a location of the creature. Usually these things occur on initiative count 20, but you don't have to use a high CR creature or a legendary monster or even a boss fight. You can use these from every combat encounter as long as you design them well. So how do you design a good lair action? Use these 3 steps. First of all, on initiative count 20, give some sort of indicator to your players that something dangerous is about to happen. Second, make sure you have a way or 2 for your players to either interrupt that dangerous thing or avoid it completely. And 3, if no one does anything to interrupt this action, have that dangerous thing happen to your players on the second initiative count 20 the following round. At the end of that initiative count 20, have the whole thing start over again. Let's give another example. Let's say you're fighting creatures inside a magical crystal cave. On initiative count 20, let's say random crystals throughout the room start glowing brighter throughout the round. Let's say 1 crystal per PC. On the next initiative 20, if no one has done at least 1 point of damage to any of these crystals, they explode with this arcane shriek. Anyone within 20 feet of one of these crystals needs to make a wisdom saving throw. Upon failing that saving throw, they'll take psychic damage and have disadvantage on all saving throws until the end of their next turn. Now you can see how this could get out of control quickly and encourage the players to have someone dedicated to that mechanic. Now what are the benefits of using this method? Well, it gives your players more choices and options. You can choose to try to defeat the enemy before that mechanic becomes out of hand, or you can tackle that method in a way to avoid it hurting your friends or come up with more creative ways to stop it. Don't stop your players from also coming up with creative ways to avoid this mechanic. Like, let's say the barbarian uses chewed tobacco and shoves them in their ears to avoid the shriek effect, but they can't hear anything. Now, what are some pitfalls to avoid while trying this method? First of all, don't have their danger or your lair action cause too much unnecessary damage. This can really mess up the balance of that combat encounter. Try using conditions instead. Having players being stunned, being prone, or being blind for a round are a lot more interesting than just doing unnecessary damage anyway. The other thing you might run into is having PCs not knowing that they can avoid this lair action mechanic. A good way to help with this is have your party encounter this mechanic before the combat encounter, ideally outside of combat. So you really give them the chance to really investigate what this mechanic can do and if they want to figure out a way to avoid it. This is called foreshadowing a future game mechanic, and video games do this literally all the time. Now, before we get into my favorite method to really punch up those combat encounters, if this video taught you something new or at least got your gears moving, I'd really appreciate if you went down and hit that like button. It really helps this video get in front of other dungeon masters looking for help, so thanks a lot. Now let's talk about my absolutely favorite method on really increasing the tension of these combat encounters, and that's using something I like to call combat counters. Now basically this is just a number that is visible to my players. Usually I'll represent this on a d6 or something else if I'm playing online. Now this number is basically a health pool for a narrative event, and when that number reaches 0, the event triggers. Let me give you another example to really cement this in. Let's say you're fighting a bunch of lesser demons, and there's also a spellcaster casting a ritual that's going to open up a portal to the abyss, allowing a bunch of demons to invade the mortal world. I would represent that ritual as a 4 on a d6. This basically represents how many rounds of combat it'll take before that ritual is complete. And let's say that spellcaster has a powerful magical barrier around them. I will also represent that barrier as a different counter, let's say a 6 on a d6. Now, anyone who uses a spell to damage the barrier, I would count that timer down by 1. Or even if your barbarian hits the barrier with a magical weapon, I'll count it down by another 1. And every round of combat that goes by, I count the ritual counter down by 1. This basically now becomes a race between both counters so your players can get through this barrier and stop this horrible ritual from happening. Because these counters aren't actually hit points and aren't limited to just certain abilities and spells to affect them, you can allow yourself and your players to be more creative on the fly. For example, let's say you have a wizard cast Dispel Magic on the magical barrier. Maybe that doesn't get rid of the barrier in total, but maybe you'll dock that counter down by 2 or 3. And you can even make this more difficult on them. Let's say the demons that they're fighting can jump through the magical barrier, and if they get into the middle of the ritual, that actually counts the ritual down by another 1, even though it's the same round. It really allows a situation for your players to delegate who's going to take down a barrier and who's going to hold off these demons from increasing the ritual speed. This takes more planning and not just you mindlessly going round by round doing damage to whomever. Also, don't be afraid to add more counters to this situation. Let's say you have a very charismatic bard who instead wants to try to talk the spellcaster out of casting the spell in the first place, and they roll really high on it. Start a new counter saying, convince the spellcaster not to do it, and have that be a whole nother counter that you can race against the ritual. Now you'll have a bunch of players trying to convince this spellcaster why they shouldn't do it. I promise you, if you practice this a couple of times, it'll really get your players to think outside the box. But remember, these are still combat encounters, so you should try to balance these in a way that still allows your players to use some of their action economy towards these other mechanics. So if you need help using the CR system, check out this beginner's guide I made. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.